Welcome to tonight's event, sponsored by the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm Marie Griffith, the center director, and it's great to see all of you here. I want to start by thanking Professor John Inazu for organizing this event tonight. I'll also note that it is being co-sponsored by the WashU Law, Public Interest Law, and Policy Speaker Series. We have a couple more events this semester to which I'd like to call your attention. Next Monday, November 4th, the Danforth Center is co-sponsoring with the Carver Project a public dialogue between author Jemar Tisby and John Inazu on Tisby's acclaimed book, The Color of Compromise, The Truth About the American Church's Complicity in Racism. So that's November 4th at 7:30 in Wrighton Hall, room 300. And on November 13th, in partnership with the Department of Jewish, Islamic, and Middle Eastern Studies, we will offer a special screening of the new documentary, The Judge, that tells the story of the Palestinian judge Khaloud al-Faqih, the first woman to be appointed as a judge on a religious court anywhere in the Middle East. The screening is at 6 o'clock, this is November 13th, in Hillman Hall, and will be followed by a panel discussion featuring the film's director, Erica Cohn, as well as WashU faculty members Tazeen Ali and Nancy Reynolds, moderated by postdoctoral research associate David Warren. So further information is available on the welcome table outside this room, and we hope you can join us for these events. Tonight, we are delighted and greatly honored to welcome religious liberty lawyer and scholar Asma Uddin. Asma Uddin is senior scholar and faculty at the Freedom Forum Institute Museum and a fellow with the Initiative on Security and Religious Freedom at the UCLA Burkle Center for International Relations. She's also a research fellow at Georgetown's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. She graduated from the University of Chicago Law School, where she was a staff editor at the University of Chicago Law Review. Her areas of expertise include law and religion, international human rights law on religious freedom, and Islam and religious freedom. She just published this book, When Islam is Not a Religion, Inside America's Fight for Religious Freedom. And I learned today that she's working on a new project titled The Politics of Vulnerability and the Right to Religion and Religious Freedom. And I'll just mention now that after tonight's event, there will be a book signing. We'll have this book for sale and signing with Asma Uddin. Uddin previously served as counsel with Beckett, a nonprofit law firm specializing in U.S. and international religious freedom cases, and as Director of Strategy for the Center for Islam and Religious Freedom, a nonprofit engaged in religious liberty in Muslim majority and Muslim minority contexts. She's also an expert advisor on religious liberty to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She's widely published by law reviews, university presses, and national and international newspapers, and she works for the protection of religious expression for people of all faiths in the U.S. and abroad. She's worked on religious liberty cases at the U.S. Supreme Court, federal appellate courts, and federal trial courts, defending religious claimants as diverse as evangelicals, Sikhs, Muslims, Native Americans, Jews, Catholics, and the Nation of Islam. Her legal, academic, and policy work focuses on freedom of expression, such as religious garb, land use, access to religious materials in prison, rights of parochial schools, religious arbitration, and so forth. Following Uddin's lecture will be a panel discussion with 3 Washington University scholars, and I will introduce them at that time. But first, Asma Uddin will speak about When Islam is Not a Religion, Inside America's Fight for Religious Freedom. Please join me in welcoming her now.
Thank you to the Danforth Center and to Professors Marie Griffith and John Inazu for inviting me here to speak, and also to my panelists for joining me in the conversation, and to all of you for coming out. As Professor Griffith mentioned, I have a new book out. It's called When Islam is Not a Religion: Inside America's Fight for Religious Freedom. The title may be confusing, maybe even bewildering, but so is the claim that gave rise to it. And that claim is that Islam is not a religion. It is instead a dangerous political ideology, and therefore Muslims do not have rights under the First Amendment. This is, of course, absurd. There are almost 2 billion Muslims across the globe, encompassing tremendous diversity, including 7 million right here in America. Yet that doesn't stop some very prominent people from saying that the First Amendment doesn't apply to these people. And it's not just a claim that we see in the Twitterverse, although we definitely see it there. We see it among lawmakers, we see it implemented into law, and we see it being argued in court. My book looks at these legal implications. It looks at the attack on the First Amendment, and it explains how this attack on Muslims affects all Americans. Because the selective application of the law will always come back to bite us. If we cede power to the government to choose what it considers a religion and what it doesn't, who's to say what's allowed today won't be prohibited tomorrow? Your religion, whatever it is at risk. I've been in this fight for religious freedom for a decade, and the principle that runs throughout my work is that everyone has a right to be wrong. Indeed, one of the hallmarks of religious liberty is that it protects people of all faiths, even if their beliefs seem unfounded, flawed, implausible, or downright silly. It's not that religious freedom requires relativism or indifference to truth. Instead, it's based on an understanding of the religious quest, searching for answers to ultimate questions and living in accordance with one's authentic beliefs. That journey is different for everyone, both among religious communities and among members of the same community. We may think that another's belief is wrong, but again, the premise behind religious freedom is that people have the right to be wrong. It is a concept inherently rooted in human dignity, because what matters isn't whether your beliefs are acceptable to the majority. You don't have to earn your rights or prove yourself worthy of them. Simply by virtue of being a human, you have access to human rights, including the fundamental human right to religious liberty. And yet, in religious freedom discourse today, the principle of human dignity is sorely lacking. No one has the right to be wrong, it seems. They can only be right, and you, the beholder, get to decide what is right. In my own work, I have rejected the selective application of rights, regardless of the particular religious group I am advocating for, and regardless of how popular or unpopular their religious beliefs and practices might be. But I have not seen a similar willingness on the part of many Americans to extend those same protections to Muslims. This is true not just of ordinary Americans, but also of Americans in positions of power. And some of the same Americans who are most vocal in advocating for a robust vision of religious freedom fall silent when it comes to Muslims' rights, or explicitly advocate against them. Indeed, in question for a lot of Americans is whether Muslims are protected by religious liberty. In other words, they're questioning whether Muslims can access rights under the First Amendment and various statutes, such as the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. Increasingly, we hear arguments made both in the courts of law and the courts of public opinion that Islam is not a religion, that it is instead a dangerous political ideology hell-bent on taking over the United States and subverting fundamental human rights. Islam is an almost otherworldly bogeyman, a larger-than-life, all-encompassing swamp creature. And in the process of stopping it, its opponents run roughshod over the human rights of everyday human beings who happen to be Muslim. For these people, again, powerful, influential people, Muslims are somehow not human enough for human rights. So who are these opponents? First, consider some general statistics on the rise of anti-Muslim sentiment. An August 2017 poll by the Annenberg Public Policy Center of the University of Pennsylvania found that almost 1 in 5 Americans believe that under the US Constitution, American Muslims do not have the same rights as other American citizens. A 2016 survey by the Pew Research Center found that almost half of all US adults believe that some American Muslims are anti-American. This number includes 11% who think most or almost all American Muslims are anti-American. A 2015 poll by the Associated Press and the NORC Center for Public Affairs Research found that Americans favor protecting religious liberty for Christians over other faith groups, ranking Muslims as at least deserving of this right. 82% voted in favor of protecting religious liberty for Christians, while only 61% said the same for Muslims. The general climate of anti-Muslim bias correlates with a sharp rise in hate crimes. Anti-Muslim hate crimes are the fastest growing religious hate crimes, roughly doubling from 2014 to 2016. In 2017, hate crimes across the board rose by 17%, more than 1,000 additional incidents than the year before. In addition to these hate crimes, more than 42% of Muslim children in grades K through 12 have experienced some type of bullying because of their faith. The New America Foundation diligently tracks this information in its data visualization project. Its interactive map displays anti-Muslim activities by state divided by type of activities. There could be anti-Sharia legislation, mosque controversies, hate crimes, etc. The long list of hate incidents reported to the media in 2018 includes, in Kansas City, Missouri, a man broke into a Muslim family's home, spray-painted religious and racial slurs inside the home, and set the staircase on fire. In St. Augustine, Florida, a man attacked Muslim students with a stun gun and knife. One of the officers reported that statements made by the defendant to the victims showed that the assailant only committed the acts due to the victim's religion. In Livingston Parish, Louisiana, a man rammed his pickup truck through a store because he thought its owners were Muslim. In Carmel, California, a man was deliberately hit twice with a car while he was walking with his family. The family was recognizably Muslim because the women were wearing headscarves. In New York, Muslim police officers with the NYPD found their lockers vandalized by colleagues who wrote anti-Muslim messages, including "F you Muslims," and spread feces on the lockers. And the list goes on. The rise in anti-Muslim sentiment and hate crimes, both rooted in the idea that Muslims are somehow less human or less deserving of human rights and religious liberty specifically, is happening at a time when religious liberty is one of the most important items on the Trump administration's agenda. Even during the 2016 election, presidential candidate Ted Cruz called the election the religious liberty election, stating that religious liberty issues were front and center in determining who the next president would be. Candidate Trump promised on the campaign trail that the first priority of my administration will be to preserve and protect our religious liberty. And indeed, President Trump has kept his promise by offering expansive religious liberty protections, from opening the new Conscience and Religious Freedom Division at the Department of Health and Human Services to issuing broad religious liberty guidance and instituting the Religious Liberty Task Force at the Department of Justice. The Department of Education has also announced its desire to change rules that prohibit federal education funding for faith-based entities. And during the last 2 years, the State Department twice held a multi-day ministerial to advance religious freedom and issued the Potomac Declaration that reasserts the United States' unwavering commitment to promoting and defending religious freedom. So on the one hand, we've seen major steps forward for religious liberty. But I can't help but notice that the steps forward for religious liberty track the issues championed by particular groups, such as conservative Christians. And right alongside them, there's a growing climate of anti-Muslim sentiment and hate crimes, and the growing salience of the claim that Islam is not a religion and Muslims don't deserve religious liberty. Even as Cruz and Trump were rallying for religious freedom on the campaign trail, they were proposing staunchly anti-Muslim measures. Trump promised to establish a database to track Muslims and suggested shutting down mosques, and Ted Cruz advocated for surveilling Muslim neighborhoods. Other presidential candidates chimed in too. Ben Carson declared that a Muslim absolutely could not be president, and Rick Santorum said the US Constitution does not protect Muslims because, quote, Islam is different from Christianity. Consider also some of the Trump administration's appointees and their positions on Islam. In 2016, former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn told an Act for America conference in Dallas, Islam is a political ideology that hides behind the notion of it being a religion. In 2017, then White House aide Sebastian Gorka could not unequivocally state that Islam is a religion when asked by Stephen Inskeep of NPR. Steve Bannon, the White House chief strategist who helped design and implement President Trump's travel ban, once mocked former President George W. Bush for stating that Islam is a religion of peace. According to Bannon, Islam is not a religion of peace, Islam is a religion of submission, by which he means submission to a nefarious agenda to take over the US. In May 2018, Fred Fleets was named Chief of Staff for President Trump's National Security Council. Fleets is currently the president of the strongly anti-Muslim Center for Security Policy and has claimed that Muslim communities in America are susceptible to a, quote, radical worldview that wants to destroy modern society, create a global caliphate, and impose Sharia law on everyone on earth. In 2018, BuzzFeed News reported that since 2015, Republican officials in 49 states have publicly attacked Islam, some even questioning its legitimacy as a religion. Here are some examples. In Oklahoma, State Representative John Bennett in 2014 called Islam a cancer and met with Muslim constituents only after they filled out questionnaires asking whether they beat their wives. Bennett has also said that Islam is not even a religion, it is a social political system that uses a deity to advance its agenda of global conquest. A Nebraska state senator proposed that Muslims be required to eat pork if they wish to enter the United States. A state senator in Rhode Island wrote that Muslim religion and philosophy is to murder, rape, and decapitate anyone who is a non-Muslim, and recommended the Syrian refugees be housed in camps. A South Dakota state senator who was then running for the United States House questioned in an official press release whether the First Amendment applies to Muslims. A 2014 Republican congressional candidate and now congressman from Georgia questioned the compatibility of Islam with the American Constitution and wrote in 2012 that, quote, Islam would not qualify for First Amendment protection since it's a geopolitical system. So a friend of mine who works with state legislatures to form bipartisan religious freedom caucuses affirms that BuzzFeed's findings reflect the general trend. He told me, on a surprising number of occasions, lawmakers raise with me their concerns about Islam. Some, I would say numbering between 7 and 10, raise with me the issue of whether we should be seeking to pass legislation banning Sharia law. I also had an equal number of lawmakers raise with me the question of whether Islam is even a religion deserving First Amendment protection. I estimate that approximately 5 to 10% of state lawmakers hold to some version of the Islam is not a religion belief. None were known in advance to be bomb throwers, so I generally avoided at that point anyway. This lopsided view of religious liberty has, of course, not gone unnoticed, and the media has reported on the failure of many religious liberty advocates to demand coherence. In a 2015 piece titled, When Muslims Are the Target, Prominent Religious Freedom Advocates Largely Go Quiet, the Washington Post Michelle Borstein wrote about the relative silence from the religious liberty camp when Republican presidential candidates made shocking statement after statement denying Muslims their civil rights. Tom Gelton of NPR also wrote a piece that year titled, Conservatives Call for Religious Freedom, but for whom? In April 2017, Peter Beinart wrote about the phenomenon for The Atlantic in a piece called When Conservatives Oppose Religious Freedom. Catherine Stewart asked that same question in an op-ed for the New York Times called Whose Religious Liberty Is It Anyway? And after the Supreme Court's decision in the travel ban case, Michelle Borstein of the Washington Post considered the difference in the way that religious liberty advocates respond to the Masterpiece Cake Shop holding versus the travel ban decision. So on June 4th, 2018, the court ruled in Masterpiece Cake Shop v. Colorado Civil Rights Commission, a case that involved Jack Phillips, a Christian baker who refused on religious grounds to bake a wedding cake for a gay couple. The court ruled 7-2 in favor of the Christian baker, holding that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, in reviewing the gay couple's complaint against the baker, had treated religion with overt hostility, at one point even comparing Phillips to Nazis. This, the court held, was unacceptable. Religion, under the US Constitution, cannot be treated with so much contempt. The commission's hostility was inconsistent with the First Amendment's guarantee that our laws be applied in a manner that is neutral toward religion, the court's opinion read. And yet just 3 weeks later, the court's majority utterly failed to comprehend the gravity of the president's animus against Muslims. It upheld the travel ban despite evidence of prejudice far more egregious than the evidence in Masterpiece. The great importance of national security pushed the court to defer to the president almost completely. Justices Sotomayor and Ginsburg argued in their dissent, however, that the extreme deference was unwarranted where the prejudice was so strong. National security was mere window dressing, that try as it might just could not conceal the obvious fact that the ban was steeped in, quote, impermissible discriminatory animus against Islam and its followers. Regardless of whether one agrees with the dissent's view of the law, what is relevant here is how the public, and especially American Muslims, received the opinion and how it understood the contrast between the two holdings. Again, Borstein of the Washington Post took to task the religious liberty groups that celebrated Phillips's win in Masterpiece, but failed to decry the travel ban decision or say anything at all. Even if the religious liberty groups agreed with the outcome based on the law, why didn't they say anything about the overt anti-Muslim hostility that was necessarily wrapped up in the public discourse about the case? Even if the law required the justices to rule the way they did, there are avenues to change the law. Why didn't religious liberty advocates say anything about that? More recently, in February 2019, Alabama executed Dominic Ray, a Muslim death row inmate, while without accommodating his request to have an imam in the room with him. The clergy permitted in the execution chamber were limited to the ones on staff, but the prison employed Christian clergy only. Ray challenged the prison's denial on religious liberty grounds. His case made it to the US Supreme Court, which ruled against him and permitted the execution to proceed without the imam. The decision shocked many Americans, leaving them wondering, in the words of the New York Times editorial board, is religious freedom for Christians only? Or as Borstein wrote in her piece, the difference in response raises new questions about what precisely is meant by religious liberty in America today. Indeed, the very definition of religious liberty is the biggest question facing the First Amendment. Does it apply to all Americans equally? Now, it's bad enough when politicians argue that Islam is not a religion, but what is really scary for me is when this bogus argument moves from the political to the legal arena. That's what we're seeing in the US today, particularly in the land use context, involving either constructions of mosques or Muslim cemeteries. Perhaps the best known example of this is the 2010 case challenging a county approval of building plans for a mosque in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. According to the mosque's opponents, Islam was not a religion, but rather a geopolitical system bent on instituting jihadist and Sharia law on America. Because Islam is not a religion, the argument went, the mosque construction plans did not get to benefit from any of the county or federal laws that protect religious organizations. The Islamic Center Murfreesboro case was unique in that the arguments were actually made in court. But in just about every other scenario where a local Muslim community is trying to build or expand a mosque, they are faced with strong public backlash, much of it centered on this idea that Islam is not a religion. My contacts at the Department of Justice have confirmed that this argument comes up in pretty much all of their mosque or Muslim cemetery cases. This is also the story I heard from Dawood Abu Diab, whose mosque in Columbia, Tennessee was firebombed. It's what I heard from Aya Zayed, who worked for years to push back against local opposition against a mosque in Montgomery, Alabama. It is what the Muslim community in Farmersville, Texas faced when it tried to build a Muslim cemetery. In the Murfreesboro case, the judge permitted a 6-day hearing in which the plaintiff's attorney literally put Islam on trial. And the Department of Justice had to file an amicus brief explaining that under the US Constitution and other federal laws, it is uncontroverted that Islam is a religion and a mosque is a place of religious assembly. The argument that Islam is not a religion also undergirds efforts to prevent Muslim religious arbitration. Proponents call these measures anti-Sharia bills. They insist on the supposed threat of Sharia to American values, despite the fact that the American legal system has safeguards in place to resist excesses and abuses, the types of things that American Muslims, like all Americans, are opposed to. For example, there must be voluntary participation from both parties. The arbitrator must be neutral. Parties have the right to choose what law governs a dispute. Once a process has begun, it can be terminated if both parties consent, and a court must sign off on any decision for it to be legally binding. Judgments are also ultimately subject to the country's national law or public policy. These safeguards have worked, and Sharia arbitration has not raised problems in the US. Despite this, there is a powerful movement to ban it. Since 2010, 201 anti-Sharia law bills have been introduced in 43 states. In 2017 alone, 14 states introduced an anti-Sharia law bill, with Texas and Arkansas enacting the legislation. Idaho introduced a bill in 2018. These preposterous arguments and legal efforts aside, Muslims also face legal hurdles to religious liberty in more subtle forms. In 2010, Professor Richard Schrager at the University of Virginia Law School argued that in today's politicized climate, the outcome of a case could be different merely if one switches out a Christian plaintiff for a Muslim one, with Christians more likely to win. As it turns out, empirical studies on judicial decision-making support his conclusion. There is evidence that Muslims, more than any other religious group, face biased judges. Researchers Gregory Sisk and Michael Hayes looked at all religious liberty cases, Muslims and otherwise, decided between 1996 and 2005, and found that Muslim claimants faced a marked disadvantage. Compared to non-Muslims, Muslims are half as likely to win their religious liberty case in federal court. The number shrinks further when it's a Muslim prisoner bringing the case, with Muslim prisoners succeeding only a third as often as non-Muslim prisoners. So what might account for the Muslim disadvantage? Sisk and Hayes considered a number of theories. They looked at whether, because prisoners bring most Muslim claims, the claims are largely frivolous. They also looked at whether the prisoner claims were treated differently for substantive reasons, or whether Muslim claims lost because they're bringing culture war claims that clash with the secular state. But Muslims don't bring culture war claims. Having considered then dismissed a number of explanations, Sisk and Hayes settle on their final explanation. Muslims are at a pronounced disadvantage because they are Muslim. The cases Sisk and Hayes examined involve a religious believer challenging some decision by the government, a decision that a public officer defends as necessary to American law and order. These types of cases trigger base stereotypes about Muslims or Islam. After all, a religious liberty claim by a Muslim puts Islam front and center. A judge may rule on the basis of these assumptions without even realizing it. The evidence shows that the wider fear and distrust of Islam and Muslims as a threat to American values and safety infects judges too. Even if judges might try to avoid the constant negative news stream, Islam poses a particular challenge. So beyond these examples, my book also looks at other limits on religious freedom, not just for Muslims, but for religious minorities more broadly. I also spend my last chapter on today's culture wars, which have pitted religious freedom against sexual freedom. There, I assess how those culture wars intersect with Islamophobia. Now, you might be surprised when you get to that chapter to learn that I've actually litigated and otherwise advocate in support of various conservative Christian claims to religious freedom. I was part of the legal team supporting Hobby Lobby in its case at the US Supreme Court. For those of you who don't know what the case was about, it involved the Hobby Lobby craft stores that are owned by a fundamentalist Protestant family that objected to covering two forms of contraception in the employee health insurance required by the Affordable Care Act. The two drugs were the morning after and the week after pill, which the Hobby Lobby owners said constituted abortifacients and thus violated their religious beliefs against facilitating abortion. That I advocate on their behalf does not necessarily mean that I have any particular sympathy for their religious claim. Instead, I recognized, quite simply, that religious liberty protects the right to be wrong. It's precisely that sort of consistency and integrity in my defense of the principle that has made conservative audiences receptive to my book and my plea for equal rights for Muslims. It's been an interesting journey so far on my book tour, with the reviews, whether it's in the Washington Post, The Economist, or Christianity Today, commenting in some way or another in my involvement in Hobby Lobby. Some folks on the left have scoffed at me. I've seen this comment on Facebook, she supported the right-wingers in Hobby Lobby, and now she wants them to be nice to Muslims. Good luck with that. But as cynical as they are, the fact is that it is working. The very fact that I was featured in Christianity Today is a testament to that. I have received kind emails from conservative readers. I have addressed the Heritage Foundation and the National Religious Broadcasters. When was the last time we saw these guys supporting Muslims' rights? But I tell them, look, I'm sticking up for you, even as I'm pointing out their hostility toward Muslims. And in return, I expect you to stick up for my community. I use the language of religious liberty to argue my case, and what I've seen time and again is an opening, a receptivity to listen and be in conversation. Why do I think they're willing to listen and to listen sincerely? Part of it is self-interest. All of our rights are tied up together, so they can't really step on mine without stepping on their own. Part of it is a reverence for America's founding ideals. There's nothing more core to America than its tradition of religious freedom, as fraught as that process has been at times. And part of it is because I care to engage these folks and not dismiss them. Instead of dismissing their concerns as invalid or as mere pretext for bigotry, the oppression of women, and any number of other claims leveled at conservatives these days, I said, I understand. Your claims are motivated by sincere religious belief. You're genuinely worried about your ability to live according to those beliefs, and you're not a bad person because you feel that way. This last piece of it, caring to engage and not dismiss, is the focus of my next stage of work. How is this model for civil dialogue and people learning to live with each other across deep difference? How can we peace build across the culture war divide? How is religious liberty a critical tool in that peace building? Because if it's working to whatever extent in my work with conservatives, then I am optimistic and hopeful that it might just work in other contexts as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asma. It is now my pleasure to introduce our panelists and moderator. I'm going to try to keep this brief for time's sake. Our first panelist is Tazeen Ali. Tazeen Ali has just joined us to become Assistant Professor of Religion and Politics at the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. Her research and teaching focus on Islam in America, women's religious authority, and Islam, gender, and race. Her book in progress, Rethinking Interpretative Authority, Gender, Race, and Scripture at the Women's Mosque of America, analyzes how American Muslim women negotiate the Islamic tradition to cultivate religious authority and build gender-equitable worship communities. Professor Ali received her PhD in religious studies from Boston University in 2019. She was a visiting postgraduate student in Islamic studies at the University of Edinburgh from 2017 to 2018. Prior to that, she earned a graduate certificate in women's gender and sexuality studies from Boston University, as well as a master's degree in Islamic studies right here at Washington University in St. Louis. She earned her bachelor's degree with honors in both religion and biology from Lehigh University. Laurie Maffly-Kipp is our second panelist. She is the Archer Alexander Distinguished Professor at the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. She also serves as the Director of the Religious Studies Program at Washington University in St. Louis in Arts and Sciences. Prior to joining the center, Professor Maffly-Kipp taught for 24 years at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in religious studies as well as American studies. She earned her BA from Amherst College in English and Religion and completed the PhD in American History at Yale. Professor Maffly-Kipp's research and teaching focus on African American religions, Mormonism, religion on the Pacific borderlands of the Americas, and issues of intercultural contact. Her many publications include Religion and Society in Frontier California, where she explored the nature of Protestant spiritual practices in Gold Rush, California, articles on Mormon Protestant conflicts in the Pacific Islands, African Americans in Haiti and Africa, and Protestant outreach to Chinese immigrants in California, as well as several co-edited collections. And most recently, she authored Setting Down the Sacred Past, African American Race Histories, as well also American Scriptures, which is a Penguin Classics anthology of sacred texts, and Women's Work, a co-edited collection of writings by African American women historians. Currently, she is working on a survey of Mormonism in American life that will be published by Basic Books. She's the recipient of numerous fellowships and grants, and her work in African American religion was honored with the James W.C. Pennington Award from the University of Heidelberg in 2014. Tonight's moderator is John Inazu, the Sally D. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion, who holds a joint appointment in the WashU Law School and the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. He earned his PhD at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and his JD and BSE at Duke University. He clerked for Judge Roger L. Woolman of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit and served 4 years as an Associate General Counsel with the Department of the Air Force at the Pentagon. From 2014 to 2015, he was a senior fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. And in addition to his academic positions, Inazu serves as the executive director of the Carver Project. Professor Inazu's scholarship focuses on the First Amendment freedoms of speech, assembly, and religion, and related questions of legal and political theory. His first book, Liberties Refuge, The Forgotten Freedom of Assembly, seeks to recover the role of assembly in American political and constitutional thought. His second book, Confident Pluralism, Surviving and Thriving Through Deep Difference, looks at legal and civic practices in a pluralistic society. He is the author of many other academic articles as well as writings for mainstream audiences in publications including USA Today, Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post. So please join me now in welcoming our panelists and moderator to the stage.
Well, thanks everyone for coming out, and thanks to this panel and for the talk. We'll make this conversational, so feel free to jump in and interrupt as well. But I'd like to start, Tazeen and Laurie, if you just want to offer some reflections on the talk we heard, and I'm looking forward to the different lenses and frames that we'll give to this talk and context.
Sure. So thank you, John, for organizing this panel, and thank you, Asma, for your wonderful talk. The narrative you advocate here for Muslims' religious freedoms is really powerful, and I'm especially appreciative of the way you weave in so many examples that are specifically involving the stories of people as in discussions of Muslims interacting with the legal system, whether it's facing employment discrimination or anti-Sharia legislation, and even your own family's story of building a Muslim community in Florida. And I think that these human stories make the case more compelling because it puts a face to who Muslims are and what's at stake for when a whole religion is called into question, because they illuminate for a wider public who Muslims are, their community members and their neighbors, and not a foreign entity. And as someone in Islamic studies, one of the things I was reminded of as I was reading, especially about the anti-Sharia legislation, is this desperate need for increased religious literacy in the US. And the idea, I was struck by the fact that in the post-9/11 context, the word Sharia has become this household term, but it's almost always mistranslated as Islamic law. And this is something that, to those who specialize in Islamic legal theory, are always really careful to differentiate between Sharia and fiqh, which is Islamic jurisprudence. And I appreciated the way you start this conversation about identifying Sharia as a path to water. But Sharia broadly is divine law that's based in Quran and Sunnah, while jurisprudence, fiqh, is the human attempts to understanding Sharia in society and the legal theory that's aimed at cultivating an ethical praxis, that's aimed at cultivating a moral self in Muslims. And interestingly, it hasn't been considered throughout Islamic history as divine by Muslims or by lay Muslims or by legal scholars, because it is recognized as a human interpretive activity, that there's been a lot of diversity across region and across time among Muslims about what constitutes right legal practice. And so to me, part of what contributes to the fear and hostility in a lot of the anti-Sharia debates that you talk about and discuss is the mistranslation to Islamic law, because people get this impression that it is somehow Islamic law or Sharia is somehow equivalent to the US legal system that has coercive powers through the coercive powers of the mechanisms of the state. And so I wanted to talk a little bit, just reflect on what American Muslims' actual relationship to Sharia is. And this is reflected in actually pre-modern legal manuals as well. And it's really concerned with ritual practice. And so Sharia is very much, jurisprudence is very much concerned with how to pray and when to pray and how to prepare properly for prayer in terms of ritual ablution. And then with things like marriage and divorce and death, birth and things like that. And so this is really where Sharia, where American Muslims and Muslims globally engage with Sharia at this level. And I think it's kind of ironic that the term Sharia seems to enter into the American Muslim lexicon as a result of this broader fixation with it in US public discourse. And I thought that might be relevant to this conversation.
I also want to thank you and just echo some of Tazeen's points about the abundance of really interesting examples that you have drawn upon to make this case. And as someone who studies history and sort of sees this over a longer span and knows more about some other groups alongside Muslims, there's so much of this that echoes for me with other kinds of patterns we've seen in American history before this, and in other histories, actually. First of all, the idea of people defining religion as legitimate belief and practice, and trying to make a distinction between what's legitimate and what's not, goes back to sort of the earliest cases of the early Christians who argued with one another about who had the true faith. They accused each other of some of the same things that people get accused of today. They were either political, not really religious. They weren't theological enough. They were really just practicing sexual immorality and weren't sincere about their beliefs. So they had nefarious motives. And throughout American history, you see all kinds of people trying to make distinctions between what they want to call religion, which is the legitimate thing, and heresy or superstition or magic. Those are all bad things, generally. Or sometimes politics. Sometimes separating religion from politics is a way of saying, you know, your motives are not sincere. They're not sincerely religious, as if there's a way to separate out those two things in some ideal world. So, you know, a lot of these patterns go way back. I thought a lot as, you know, I was reading about the case with Muslims of the earliest enslaved Africans who, when missionaries, first the Church of England missionaries and later evangelical missionaries, wanted to go evangelize slaves in the 18th century, the way that they observed the behavior of the slaves was to say, well, they aren't religious at all. They're superstitious, and they're doing these funny things because they didn't understand what it was they were seeing. And so some of this, I think, does get back to Tazeen's point about just a basic illiteracy about how other religions or other religious systems function. So, you know, I think we all are sort of big proponents of studying religion, that it's sort of an important way to understand what's going on in the world around us. The only other point I would make just off the bat is that what struck me in reading this was it reinforces the point that religious liberty is not a destination. It's not a place we're going to reach, some nirvana of religious liberty where we all magically get along together with enough understanding and even enough conversation, which I, like you, agree is obviously a critical thing. But it's, in and of itself, it's a process of dialogue and negotiation over time. I mean, in the founding of the Constitution, the founding fathers never conceived of the kind of religious diversity we see today. So I think some of what you see in the court cases that you've so helpfully spelled out is just that each new situation that comes along, people say, ugh, we never thought of that, you know, or we never thought about religion that way. We're going to have to, you know, sort of renegotiate and try as best we can to come up with some kind of accommodation that can make sense of these new realities. And so to see that as sort of unfolding and always a process of education and dialogue, I think is really valuable.
Great.
Laurie, it strikes me that another through line in some of the historical examples is a concern that...
there's some concern. I can't hear you.
Oh.
That's going to have to be, okay, it's going to have to be back there. That's going to help me. And there's some feedback up here too. But it strikes me, Laurie, that one of the through lines in the American story is a concern of the loss of social control. So the Anglicans weren't so sure about the Baptists, and the Baptists weren't sure about the Quakers, and then we get the Catholics and the Mormons and the Jews and the concern, and now we have with Islam this concern, well, we're going to lose control of the social order. And it seems that part of the story or the backstory here today, Asma, is this, this lack of empathy from a conservative Christian segment of the population that is concerned with loss of control. I wonder if you might talk about that dimension of this. So not so much from the side of Islam, but from what is the frame of the people who are, you tell some of the stories in your book about people who will come up after you in your talks and will say, well, okay, maybe there's some harm to Muslims today, but the real persecution is against Christians in this country. And so what goes into that mindset, and how does that factor into the story here?
Sure, and that has something to do with this next project that Professor Griffith mentioned, the politics of vulnerability and the threat to religion and religious freedom. And I sort of touch on this in the last chapter of the book, and I hope that the second book will actually pick up where the first one ends. And it's really kind of just looking at, you know, it was something when I was like thinking through this, and I was talking to different people who kind of work with, who themselves are conservative, but are on the same side as me with this idea of religious freedom for all. Be like, you know, the way that this is necessarily tied up also with the U.S. culture wars, right? I mean, and we're so often thinking about the sort of relationship between conservative Christians and Muslims, and we tend to think of it that it always has to do with terrorism, just concerns about violence, maybe even religious competition, like sort of the epic, worldly battle between Christianity and Islam. And those are all important components of that conversation, the question about race, for instance. But the piece of it that I think is often overlooked and that I hope to look at more in my next project is how does the US culture wars, all this sort of like feeling of being under siege, the vulnerability, the fear, the anxiety, the way you phrase it, loss of control, that a lot of conservatives are feeling in a very drastically changing America. And I think that the case that really kind of encapsulated this for a lot of conservatives was the Bergefell v. Hodges, right? Like the US Supreme Court case that said that there's a constitutional right to same-sex marriage. And I think that many ways was just sort of like, wow, like our country is changing in extremely drastic ways that we can't even recognize our country as what we thought it was. And I think often that feeling of alarm and feeling of being under siege is mocked in our political discourse, in our popular discourse. It's just sort of like, wow, a bunch of people who aren't, who are used to being entitled are complaining about losing their entitlement. Or like, why are you talking about persecution? Like, what about all these minorities who are struggling for their rights? The two issues just don't compare. And my inquiry is really, well, what happens if we just validate that sense of persecution and we just sort of say, we understand what you're feeling as legitimate and not something that just needs to be dismissed and mocked. And what happens then? If that can be a starting point. Because the other thing I'm noticing is that this sort of like strange phenomenon of complaining about the threat of secularism, the threat to religion, the threat most recently sort of explained in a speech by Bill Barr and another speech by Secretary Pompeo, the threat to Christian morality, the threat to Judeo-Christian values. And so they're both complaining about the threat to religion, but they're specifically making sure that religion is defined in very specific Christian terms. And you see that even in legal and policy advocacy. You see, for instance, a number of challenges against accommodations for Muslim students in public schools, for instance, coming from conservative Christian groups whose mission statement says that they've been organized to fight secularism, and yet their actual actions are that they're fighting against religious accommodations for Muslims. And it's just like, well, how do you square that? How do you square your desire to protect religion and your fight against religion? And the first step is, of course, the fact that in their minds, Islam is not a religion. So it's so easy to make sense of that contradiction. But it's also like, well, Muslims are championed by the left. They're championed by the same people who are coming after us. And so there's like this phenomenon of like Muslims are somehow the friend of the enemy, and therefore they're also the enemy, right? And so much response to this book has been, whether it be in social media or even in some of these public speaking engagements that I was telling you about, the national religious broadcasters, for instance, like, oh, well, you complain about like Muslims and the media and how it's treated by the media, but if you go to Google, I went to Google and I put in Christians and I saw all these articles pop up that were mocking Christians. But if you put in Muslim, you're going to see all these great art stories about Muslims, like really positive stories. And I see that in social media, like, okay, maybe there's some issues that Muslims are facing, but by far, Christians are the persecuted group. Like, just look at what the elite media is doing to Christians. And so I'm like, well, what do we do? How do we just stop, this competing victimhood? What someone once termed the victim Olympics. And if we can just maybe address these issues, maybe a lot of the hostility that comes from this vulnerability might also be addressed.
Tazeen, this is not the first time that people have made the charge that Islam is not a religion. Could you fill in some of the historical context for us there?
Sure. So I think that anti-Muslim hostility really dates back to the founding of the United States. And specifically, I think, and so scholars of Islam in the US kind of locate the earliest hostilities and the earliest anxieties about Muslim presence in the US to 1788 and discussions on the ratification of the Constitution, particularly on Article 6, which stipulates that no religious test should be required for public office. And this was used as a basis for fear-mongering by anti-federalists to say that if this clause is included, then God forbid one day a Catholic or a Muslim might occupy the presidency. So this dates back. And so really, when we think about Islamophobia, which is what this claim of Islam not being a religion is rooted in, there are a few different levels of that. And on one level, it's the anti-Muslim bigotry that we see on the ground. And there are so many harrowing instances that you recall in the book, Asma, that are really powerful to kind of see all in list form and in writing. But it also operates at the state level as a way to control and discipline American Muslims. And the United States has actively been engaged in the systematic production of Islamophobia since the early 20th century through FBI surveillance, police surveillance, harassment, violence. And so FBI manuals in the 1930s actually portrayed Nation of Islam members as primitive, violent, and not really Muslims, but rather using the masquerade of religion to promote their hateful ideology. And so they were racialized by the state and conceived as these political others that threatened the white Christian majority. And so what's interesting in the FBI's propaganda campaigns about the Nation of Islam not really being a religion, not really being Islamic, they drew this distinction between this real, authentic Islam that was located in the Middle East versus what Black Muslims in the US were doing. But at that time in the 1930s, there were a lot of restrictions on immigration from non-European countries. And so in the 1960s, when those immigration laws were reversed and there was the first influx of Muslim immigrants from the Arab world and from South Asia, those Muslim immigrants too, and were very easily and readily conceived also as enemies of the state. And a lot of recent scholarship has attended to this phenomenon. Like people like Sylvester Johnson and Edward Curtis write about how by that point, American Muslim practices, as diverse as they were already so entrenched into the anti-Black state framework of surveillance. And so all of this is to say that Islamophobia can't really be understood without seeing it as continuous with the legacy of and the contemporary manifestations of anti-Blackness. And so I think when you're not looking at it in the case of these specific court cases, I think in a broader historical sense, it's kind of hard to conceive of religious freedom in the US for Muslim minorities on the level of the state, because in practice, these communities have always been subjected to state-sanctioned surveillance and violence, and in the post-9/11 context, that's only been exacerbated.
Asma, one of the puzzles for me, I mean, not too much of a puzzle because I think I understand some of the politics, but at least a conceptual puzzle is why wouldn't conservative Christians move more toward, especially conservative Muslims who would share some of their own values in the American political context? And then to ask a second but related part of the question, how firm, you mentioned earlier that Muslims are embraced by the left right now, how firm of a friendship is that, or is that a contingent relationship? And what about the tensions? You mentioned in your book, you're quoting someone else saying that people seem worried about a creeping Sharia, but the real concern is a creeping liberalism into Islam. And so as Islam, particularly immigrants coming to this country from Muslim countries, try to negotiate both a conservatism on the one hand and an uneasy liberalism on the other hand, how do you see those two sectors relating?
Yeah, so on the question of the alliance between conservatives and Muslims, and so just as a pre-note, it's like I don't actually talk in the book about what I think are the better alliances, right? Like I'm not a political strategist. I understand these alliances are complex. My point there is really just to kind of tease out some of the weaknesses and then the problems I see in the way that the question of political coalitions are being thought through in the Muslim community and among, by the left and the right when they decide to make these decisions about whether or not to work for or against Muslims. And so simply, I just feel like religious freedom, we've been talking about religious literacy, but I think legal literacy, sort of the basic idea of how religious liberty works and why we should all care, because the fact is that all of our rights are tied up together. I think there needs to be a better and clearer understanding of that in this ongoing conversation between liberals, conservatives, and Muslims. Why isn't there an alliance? There used to be one. Up until George W. Bush, Muslims in America were almost uniformly voted Republican, and it was only sort of with the foreign policy decisions by George W. Bush that there was like this massive sort of shift to the Democratic Party, where now it's really hard to find somebody who might actually publicly admit to being a Republican. I mean, there's definitely Muslim Republicans, but I think they're pretty rare, and even more rare is for them to just talk about it. And I think, what happened, I think that there's a number of different theories that I offer in the book. I mean, I think, again, it goes back to this idea of feeling under attack. And there's Brian Grimm is a researcher formerly of the Pew Research Center who has a study that basically looks at correlations between when a government begins to restrict religious freedom, that increases social hostilities against religious groups. And so in the US context, what that would mean is that as conservatives feel that the government is restricting their religious freedom, which is what many conservatives feel with this various litigation happening with the contraceptive mandate, with same-sex marriage and the conflict there with religious beliefs, et cetera, this shows up in social hostility against minorities. And in this case, Muslims are one of the victims of that. And I also, as earlier I pointed out, just like that entire sort of alliances, the way they've worked, that many of the very sort of vocal public champions of Muslims' rights are the same people who are very vocally against conservative Christian rights. And so there's just sort of this lumping in that, in the imagination and the approach. And of course, Muslims aren't, they're not, without fault here. I think that because of those alliances, because of the funding that many large Muslim civic groups get, they tend to fall into line with the same talking points that are anti-conservative. And to their defense, and to my community's defense, it's also because the most vocal and egregious attacks on the community do come, unfortunately, from conservatives. But of course, as you pointed out, that alliance between the left and Muslims is not without its own complications. And I think we're increasingly beginning to see that. I sort of point to that in the book. I'm just like, well, this is not something that's without conditions, right? We are going to protect you if you're also going to go along with the rest of our political agenda. And so for traditional Muslims who might have a different idea of sexual freedom and gender equality, or a progressive vision of gender equality, this is going to raise some thorny questions. And so again, in the book, I'm not really telling anyone this is how you should decide. I'm simply saying, here are a couple of things you should think about when thinking through that issue. And I think what's interesting is the conversations that I've had after this book, where a number of other groups, like people from the LDS community, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, people from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and others have said, we kind of understand what you're talking about because we also feel like we're political orphans, right? Like many Mormons or members of the LDS Church, are the conservative, but they're kind of not really liked by a lot of conservatives, right? They're just like, we're kind of left out in the cold. Or people from the Seventh-day Adventist Church are like, well, in some issues we agree with Democrats, and other issues we agree with Republicans, and so we just sort of feel like we're torn in this way. And so I think that question of just complexity and the fact that you can't very easily, I don't think the Muslim community is unique in the fact that it can't easily just sort of find authentic alliances. Yeah,
you mentioned the Mormons, and Laurie, I was thinking during some of this dialogue about 2012 and Romney, and looking at some religious conservatives who were distancing themselves from Romney, and I was thinking, he's probably your guy, right, if you're going to bet on a horse here. And so can you talk about sort of some of the tensions with maybe Mormonism and conservative Christianity in the current context?
Yeah, it was fascinating to see how that played out in Romney's candidacy, that conservative evangelicals historically have been very anti-Mormon. When I was living in North Carolina, I used to see the Southern Baptist guy with the sign out on the street in front of the Mormon temple all the time, just protesting the fact that it existed at all. So there is, a long history to that kind of persecution. On the other hand, Mormons over the 20th century have tried at various points in time to make common cause, political cause, with conservative evangelicals, because they do come out sharing a lot of the same kinds of values, if it comes down to questions of politics and family values, things like that. So they've sort of, in recent years, found ways to work together strategically. I think it's kind of like what you're saying, Asma, that if you can sort of find these common values, that you can sort of put in the background a lot of your disagreements. And that does happen, but I think the politics surrounding Romney's candidacy really brought that out. I also wanted to, say something else. I'm glad you raised the issue of gender politics here, because I think that you do see this in the LDS church. The difference, and this is more a question for you maybe, the difference that I would see is that within the context of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, there's a significant minority of members of the church who are not happy with the church's stance on gender politics, right? So there are movements within that movement. However, there's still a hierarchy and a bureaucracy that makes the decisions. So, that's not quite analogous to the situation with Islam, right? To have a central authority like that who really speaks on behalf of the community. So do you see, it'd be an interesting question, who would the Muslims go talk to? Presumably they'd go talk to church leadership, but if Mormons wanted to go talk to Muslims, how would they know who to talk to? That's really an open-ended kind of question about dialogue.
Oh, so about gender issues?
Well, yeah, so take that as one example of a kind of issue that might come up, but who would, in finding partners, even conservative evangelicals are fairly, there's no central organization there's no one central organization. Who would, in the Muslim community, wouldn't there be lots of disagreements over who you would talk to in the first place? Or which voices one would listen to? It's more of a practical question, actually.
Well, I think it depends on what the purpose of the dialogue is, right? So if there's some sort of bigger community, interfaith, project that's going to be presented sort of as a national interfaith alliance, then I think, it depends. I would probably say there's a number of large Muslim civic organizations that they can go to and find the leadership there. If it's about local partnerships, I think people like Tazeen are a great person to talk to, right? We have so many amazing female scholars who are up and coming, who are really kind of wrestling with this question of gender and Islam and finding plenty of support in the traditional Islamic scholarship for a much broader vision of gender equality. And so I think it really just depends who you go to, and I think there's always going to be people contesting that isn't the proper. Even in part of my comments, I've said, well, there's a disconnect. I talk about in the book, there's a disconnect between some of the big Muslim advocacy organizations and the positions that they're taking, which are partly a function of maybe they don't fully understand the issues, or maybe it's a product of also who's funding them. And there's a disconnect between what, for instance, these groups are doing and what the average sort of Muslim living in American suburb might feel on these issues, right? And so I think that there's always going to be a question of authority and how authentic that authority and that alliance is, but I think you can begin to carve out some spaces. Mm-hmm.
We're going to, in just a few minutes, turn to your questions, so be thinking about what you want to be asking anyone on the panel except for me. But before we get to that, one of the things I was thinking of as you were talking was that how complicated and nuanced inner religious dialogue is with all of these traditions we're talking about, and how there is no one representation. You have a great line in your book when you say you were just tired when you were visibly identifiable as Muslim. You were tired of being asked to represent 1.8 billion people whenever someone asked you a question, right? And I think there's kind of a not just a lack of understanding, but sometimes a laziness that forgets nuance. And one of the things I really appreciate about your book is it's not only clearly written, but it's nuanced. And it's nuanced on the legal analysis, and it's nuanced on the faith part as well. I'm curious, before we go to the audience questions, based on the initial engagement you've had with the book in the past few months of talking to people around the country, where are you most pessimistic and where are you most optimistic?
Okay, well, the optimistic part is easy because I kind of already talked about that. So in terms of, the people, so I get these amazing reader emails, people who are just and a lot of them are conservatives. They're we cracked open the book and we knew from the first page that it wasn't the usual, what they would say, the usual sort of defense of Muslims' rights as sort of through a very anti-conservative lens. And I just kept reading, and there were so many important things that I understood, and you've opened my eyes, and that's been amazing. Just connecting with just Americans, average Americans. But also the openings I've had, when I was the person who invited me to speak at this National Religious Broadcasters meeting for the leadership, and then I'll be at their convention in February, which should be interesting. But it wasn't just the person who invited me. The person who invited me is actually senior counsel for ACLJ, which is Jay Sekulo's group. And I'm just and he's just this really smart, thoughtful guy. And the fact that he invited me to speak to them, and then after I spoke, that all these people came up to me afterwards and were so grateful and kind in their response to my remarks. Interviewed by the Christian Post, and they wrote a great piece. And I think that was just cool. Like, I was like, this is authentic. I just feel like I've connected with these people, and they're just like this kindness that I think sometimes gets missed in our constant conversation about how people are actually against each other. So that's the optimism. And I think, I guess, pessimism. Well, there was an interesting, I shared this earlier in your class, like there was an interesting experience. I was asked to speak by a large organization that I'll leave unnamed, and I was invited by their the employee resource group that's for people of faith, to come and give a talk on religious freedom. Like, the talk was just like, I don't exactly know what it was titled, but it just had the word religious freedom in there. And there was like this huge sort of like outcry, there was kind of like an outcry by the employee resource group for LGBT employees, that why is this corporation sponsoring a talk on religious freedom? Like, religious freedom as a term is triggering for us. All we think of is all the people who use religious biases to act against us and to oppress us, to marginalize us. And ultimately the talk got postponed. I don't know if it's gonna happen. But that was just kind of, just really sort of discouraging, because it kind of really just showed me what religious freedom has become. That was less of a Muslim issue in that case. In fact, the question that was asked by the LGBT group was, what does Islamophobia have to do with religious freedom? Which to me was just like, both like crazy, but also just really sad. That question would even be asked. But it's because the religious freedom at this point has just become, basically understood as an agenda against the rights of women and LGBT individuals. So that's not so much like like something dealing with Muslims, but I think that definitely, I think what we've talked about a lot today is the fact that because of that culture war and because of the way that religious freedom has become politicized, religious minorities have just lost out. It's not just Muslims, but it's like I've heard Hindu activists and others just be like, the entire religious freedom conversation has been hijacked by this conversation on LGBT rights. And who does that leave out to just hang out to dry? It's those of us dealing with actual prejudice and discrimination and hate crimes, because our issues just aren't on the radar. They're just not as important. All the religious freedom conversation energy is being taken up by this other question. And so I think that's probably the pessimism. Yeah.
What questions do you all have for the panel? We got a couple mic runners, so we'll maybe alternate sides. Start over here. In the back there.
Hi, my name is Chris Parr. I teach religious studies at Webster University here in St. Louis. And having heard this subject discussed both from a political and a legal angle, I'd like to hear a little bit more of a religious critique of what's going on. So with short time, I'll just throw a Molotov cocktail. The problem with both Christianity and Islam, particularly historically, in terms of the sort of competition between them, is they both tend very strongly to be exclusivist religions. The Hebraic God requires allegiance, and one is expected as a believer to express allegiance to God. And what you're really always talking about tonight is competitions between disputed senses of an exclusivist faith, a faith which is not only not happy to have people who are wrong, but people who hold alternatives to whatever is regarded as the orthodoxy. And I would like to hear a little discussion of the way in which religions themselves can critique their tendency towards exclusivism. Christianity has done this through its history, and the First Amendment represents an example of that. And Islam has done it also culturally around the world. But there's a reason we're not talking about one other major geopolitical system, which is Buddhism. Because Buddhism as a religion, and there are a few exceptions, but Buddhism as a religion doesn't tend to claim exclusivist commitment. And Christianity and Islam both do, and that's a religious category. Thank you.
Any thoughts on the panel?
Well, just on the question of Buddhism, when I talked earlier about these various conservative Christian groups who are fighting religious accommodations, I should also note that they're not just fighting religious accommodations for Muslims, but they're also fighting them for Hindu and Buddhist there's like various claims of why is there meditation practices, being instituted in public schools, because this is actually the establishment of Buddhism. And so I think that there is some competition there. It just happens to be that the Muslim question is the one that's the biggest, just because it's just a hot topic right now in terms of the global sort of geopolitics, right? It's also the one that just in terms of just numerically has the second largest number of adherents. It's going to be the second largest religion in America. So, they were projecting 2050, but probably now they're saying like 2043. Islam will be the second largest religion in America. So I think numerically that sense of urgency is there, and also just the contentious role with everything that's going on with global politics, global terrorism, everything else. But there is that concern about Buddhism as well. And then I think, for me, I think that I'll be interested in hearing more from the religion scholars about sort of mining, the religion itself for solutions to this. I think for me, I really try to keep it laser focused on the legal question of religious freedom. For me, it's just it's really nice if we can all get along and if we can find these interfaith solutions to peace and harmony. But at the end of the day, our legal rights don't require you to like me. For you to be able to not get in the way of my rights and to protect my rights, that has nothing to do with you liking me or, of course, thinking that I'm correct, right? Again, the idea of the right to be wrong. And so I try really to be I'm going to incorporate that element of personal experience, et cetera. But at the end of the day, I hope that the legal question is very distinct from that.
Yeah, I would just add to that I think, there are a couple different strands of this that probably need to be teased out. One is sort of exclusivism in terms of believing that yours is the one true faith. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can't live in a society with other people around you who also claim to have one true faith. So there's sort of, this is, of course, in early Christianity this came up. What are we going to render unto Caesar? And what is about the Christian community? And what is the common good? And when we talk about the common good, are we talking about a diverse society, or are we talking about the religious community? Now, in the U.S., I think, my sense is there's been sort of a general agreement that we are pluralistic. We are a diverse people. So the question, I think, has been framed more around, well, are we going to let one of those exclusive religious groups control society at large? And people make various claims to do that. This is what, one of the things that the Catholic Church was accused of in the 19th century, and the Mormon Church has been accused of several times, is wanting a theocracy where the church itself controlled society. But that isn't necessarily the case, even with religions that are exclusivistic in their claims. So I think there are sort of several different trajectories for that question.
I said I wouldn't talk or answer questions, but I'm a lawyer, so I can't help myself here. I actually think it would be a mistake, and it has been a mistake in this country, when we have shied away from the exclusivism and pretended that we actually don't have these deep disagreements. So pluralism in the 1990s was kind of a kumbaya moment where we're all holding hands and pretending like we're going to be able to get along. And we do need to aim for civic friendship of a kind, but these differences are real and they go all the way down and they really matter. And there's a sense in which the people who hold exclusive and comprehensive claims about the world are not going away, right? They're going to be here, and if we suppress that difference or pretend like it doesn't exist, we're going to set ourselves up for greater problems to come. Question on this side?
My name is Dr. Salim Mohiddin. My concern is from today's talk that you are saying that Islam is not a religion. However, it is the second biggest followers are from of Islamic faith. 1.4 billion people. Now, this is the divine religion, we call it. Under the umbrella of Abrahamic faith, there are three religions. The Judaism, the prophet was Moses, and the book descended from heaven for that, Torah. Then Christianity came, and Christ was the person who propagated the Christianity. And he had the book Injil, which is the Bible. Then Muhammad, about 1400 years ago, that was a divine religion. The Quran descended on him, which is the total way of life. it has Sharia, the so-called jurisprudence.
So let me just jump in here. You don't have to worry. Every one of us up here agrees that Islam is a religion. And in fact, the real purpose of the book's
But why it is not being recognized in political sense in the United States?
Well, and I think actually the majority...
Whereas it is recognized all over the world.
And it is constitutionally, legally, and politically in most places, it is absolutely recognized as a religion. I think the point of the book and the provocative title is to point out that there are arguments in this country now claiming, sometimes disingenuously and sometimes in an uninformed way, that Islam is not a religion. But there's not a serious debate in law or religion or on this platform about whether Islam is a religion.
So why we are afraid today?
Pardon me?
Why we are so afraid that we are discussing this when it is already settled?
Well, because politics is a real thing, and there are people out there making these kinds of claims. And I think the importance of the book and the claim is to say so there are two versions of this argument. One is Islam is not a religion. The other is Islam is a religion of hate and does not deserve protection. Both of those arguments are being made by political constituencies in this country today. And those are important arguments to be aware of, to respond to, and to make sure that the law responds to as well. And I think that's what all of us are working
Yeah, I mean, just
do.
to chime in, like, I do think it's more just, I think his question is a valid one. I do think there's an emerging threat, and I do make this point to sort of connect not just the political rhetoric, but to show that how it's actually impacting actual legal rights, right? And so it's not that I expect that they're going, I mean, there was a case in Murfreesboro where it was very explicitly argued over the course of a 6-day hearing that Islam is not a religion. I mean, Islam was put on trial, and the judge allowed it to go forward, this line of really outrageous questioning for 6 days. Things like, putting county commissioners on the stand and asking questions like, do you think that a religion that oppresses women is actually religion? Do you think that a religion where a founder has sex with a 6-year-old girl, this was actually allowed to go and to be asked in court, is a religion, right? And so I don't think it's something that is super far-fetched, because it actually has happened. Even in the aftermath, I mean, if you want to take it global, I think in the aftermath of the Christchurch shootings, a senator from Australia put out an official statement on official letterhead saying that while the Muslims may have been victims in this case, they are not blameless because Islam is the religious equivalent of fascism, right? And so that talking point immediately struck me, because I was connecting all the dots in the US and all the different people, including people in the White House, who have made this claim. And so I was just like, well, this is definitely like this international talking point that, and in fact, just a few days after my book came out, the Western Conservative Summit in Colorado, the founder, the president of the summit, got up in his keynote. He actually said that while we might all know Muslims and we might like them, the fact is that Islam is not a religion and it doesn't get the same protections of the First Amendment. So I think this is definitely like something that's not just kind of like a really fringe political talking point. I think there's lots of people saying it. They're putting it out on official press releases, official letterhead, and there are legal impacts. There's been 43 states that have proposed these so-called anti-Sharia laws, which, partly, some of them have been enacted, but ultimately the aim of this movement is not really to enact the laws so much as it is about generating widespread fear and distrust of Muslims. And the entire argument of the movement is that Sharia, or Islamic law, as it's understood, is actually just this big political doctrine, which is another way, as I see it, of saying Islam is not a religion, right? Because if your entire corpus of Islam, of religious law is political, that's another way of saying that, right? And I think if you talk to the DOJ, the Department of Justice, they will tell you that actual attempts to build cemeteries and houses of worship are consistently challenged on these bases. And so that's what the book does. It really kind of takes you through the different places where this impacts our legal arguments. And then the fact that you have to kind of look beneath the surface sometimes.
Question on this side?
Hi, thank you very much. Professor Uddin, my question actually ties really nicely with what you talked about and I see Christianity being weaponized in a political sense with the Hobby Lobby decision and various other decisions. And I wonder if that's that they see Islam being politicized, the fundamentalist Christians do, because they are politicizing Christianity so much in terms of giving corporations rights to discriminate against individuals based on their personal individual beliefs. So I wonder if the view of Islam weaponizing their religion is because of their own tactics in Christianity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if their own politicization is what's making them think of Islam as a political tool. I think there's like this, if you look at what they're actually saying, there tends to be this almost sort of these blinders that they put on, like at the same time as advocating that Christianity should be implemented into policy and like varying degrees. There is a lot of the same people are the ones who are also saying that Islam is not a religion because it has political theology, right? So they deny that we can have political theology without our losing our religion status, but Islam can't have political theology without it losing its religion status. So I just see hypocrisy there. I'm not sure if their own politicization was what's making them kind of take this position, except to the extent that I think that as the sort of rise of religious freedom claims has come up and religious freedom has become this big rallying cry, and there's this attempt to really shore up those rights, I kind of see like that's happening at the same time as just making sure that all this work that we're doing to protect religious freedom in its really broad sense, we want to make sure that that doesn't benefit Muslims. And that's what Richard Schrager was getting at, right? The law professor from UVA. He's just like, it's going to get to a point where these rights have to be shared with groups that are despised and feared. I mean, he predicted that Christians will just stop advocating for those protections because they're afraid of them extending to Muslims. But I think that's what it is. Like, we want to have a really robust religious freedom, one that protects our interests, but we want to make sure that none of this work is protecting the rights of Muslims. And I think that, a really kind of clear example of that was this Morning Consult poll that found that white evangelicals are least likely, so that they looked at the scenario, the Masterpiece Cake Shop scenario, where a religious baker is refusing to make a wedding cake for a gay couple, and it asked these white evangelicals, would you protect this right for the following religious groups? And they were least likely to protect that right for Muslims. So it's not that they don't think it's a religious freedom issue, they just want to make sure that their fight on that front is not protecting Muslims.
And just to add to that, I wonder to what extent that's a representation of hypocrisy on the part of the conservative right when they deploy religious arguments to infringe upon LGBTQ rights and the rights of women, but then would not extend the same religious freedom to Muslims, because it kind of reminds me, just going back to a kind of a broader discussion on the relationship between the modern nation state and the protection of minorities more broadly. And I'm thinking specifically of Sabah Mahmood's work on the secularization of Egypt, talking about Baha'i and Coptic Christian minorities, but her conclusions also apply to Western democracies. And she argues that the nation-state apparatus, in its disavowal of religion and relegating it to the private sphere, it gets to make these claims to neutrality, but never actually delivers on their promise of religious equality, because religious equality is always necessarily determined by the norms of the religious majority. And so it almost seems like in the case of the US, it's not so much as a hypocrisy when the conservative Christian right doesn't extend those religious liberties to Muslims, but really their conception of liberty was never meant to be afforded to minorities in the first place. And so, kind of going back to an earlier point that we were talking about alliances between, in some ways we think, so you talked about pre-9/11, how most American Muslims were, voted Republican, and so there are a lot of these sort of moral similarities in views on abortion and views on LGBTQ rights. But I would say, I think in the recent months and years, there is this almost alarming sense of new alliances being formed between American Muslims and very conservative Christian right views. I'm thinking specifically of the newly minted Commission on Unalienable Rights that was started by Mike Pompeo back in July. And this is a commission that's supposed to advise Trump in some unofficial capacity about scaling back on the definition of human rights, which basically translates into going back on reproductive rights for women. And although it's not meant to officially deal with domestic issues like abortion, notably all of its members are very strong advocates against abortion. And I think in American Muslim communities specifically over the course of the last few months, they've been grappling with the fact that one of their most prominent leaders, Hamza Yusuf, is on this commission, and they feel betrayed that and they're just confused and grappling with how to deal with one of their Muslim leaders under this umbrella of a shared Abrahamic morality of thinking abortion is wrong and should be restricted and scaling back on LGBTQ rights, how an American Muslim leader could align himself with this administration and the scaling back on human rights. And so sometimes it seems like a lot of these alliances are, I think, and I totally agree with your point about the need for conversation and dialogue, and I think interfaith alliances can be so fruitful and a powerful force for social good, but sometimes it seems like they're not being done for the right reasons in the service of protecting religious liberty if it necessarily involves infringing on other minority rights, like LGBTQ rights or women's rights.
Yeah, I mean, you're touching on like a huge sort of the big debate, the thing that religious freedom has become swallowed up by, right? Like this question of non-discrimination, or gender rights or sexual freedom and religion. And so this idea of the unalienable rights, it's an argument that for those of us who saw like the briefing in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, that was the argument, right? Like yes, there's these rights to non-discrimination, but the constitutional or unalienable right to religious freedom just is supersedes that, right? It's trying to create this hierarchy. And so I think that's an ongoing conversation. It's one that's extremely heated, extremely detailed, and lots of, competing proposals as to how best to negotiate that. I mean, just from my personal conversations with Sheikh Hamza, the Muslim scholar who's part of the commission, I think he's aware of the nuances. I think, yes, he is more sort of socially conservative, but I think he understands the complexities of the space that he's in. Not that I'm defending his joining the commission. I'm just.
But it strikes me too that we've lapsed into, and it's very difficult to avoid doing this, but in the discussion we've lapsed into some generalities, right, about what Muslims think about this or what the right being hypocritical is doing, when in fact we're talking about millions of people in all of these camps, some of whom might be hypocritical and cynical, and others who might be very sincere in their defense. One of the thoughts that struck me as we were talking Hobby Lobby, though, is that there's a sense in which there's an analog here, and that some conservative Christians who make the case or the claim that Islam is not a religion are seeing a similar charge against them. This really sharpened around the time of Hobby Lobby when people began to say these are, quote, religious liberty claims in scare quotes, religious liberty, which is quite different than saying this religious liberty claim should be defeated by this government interest, but to sort of put into question the entire claim itself, analogous to saying that's not religion, this isn't religious freedom. And so these fights are complex and coming in all directions.
And that gets back to what I was saying at the beginning about sort of this trying to delegitimize other religious traditions by saying, no, that's really something else. That's really about politics, or that's really about sexuality, or that's, these things are always sort of interconnected in all kinds of ways.
We have time for one more question on this side.
Hello there. So this.
Oh.
Can I ask my question, if you people allow? So this Qasim said, I'm a broadcast journalist from Pakistan, and that is the only state that was created on the name of Islam, and still we are 70 years old, but we have movements that certain people demanding that the law should be more Islamic. And we have a constitution in accordance with the Islamic law. So if you cannot decide in a state that is 70 years old that with what intensity do you need Islamic law, how can you decide in a non-Muslim state that with what intensity do you need the Sharia there? And I'm talking about the United States. And one of the criticism is that the Sharia is not updated, the law is not updated. If you're examining a rape case, they would ask testimony where the medical examination is available. That's what we face criticism in Pakistan as well. So I just want to know that what Muslims want to achieve here in the United States in terms of jurisprudence and Sharia law. Thank you.
Well, I think that the relevance of the Sharia question is primarily how it's used in private arbitration, right? So just the ability in some of the issues that Tazeen laid out, whether it be questions of marriage and divorce, inheritance, to be able to figure out the precise sort of arrangements for those things in accordance with Islamic tradition, and to be able to take that to a panel that understands the tradition, is able to negotiate among people's rights on the basis of that tradition. And that's simply it, because sometimes, like, even, some of the cases that I talk about in the book, like, in fact, some of them are very pro-women. There's lots of very, high mahars, right, like dowries for women that are available to them under Islamic contract upon divorce that an American court might not understand. They might say, hey, this is actually discriminatory towards the man because you got him to sign up for all kinds of things that are actually permitted to Muslim women under traditional Islamic law that would just be considered just like incredibly progressive to the point of actually being anti-men. And that these things are taken to these secular courts, they don't understand the background, they don't understand the shared premises and traditions that led to the negotiation of these provisions, and so they're not able to enforce that. And so you need the sort of like the role of the arbitrator who has the necessary understanding to be able to figure out these rights. So that, I think, for me, that's sort of like almost the full scope of how I see Sharia as like a legal issue kind of playing out for American Muslims. And beyond that, I think it's just kind of like these broader sort of moral precepts that guide us in our actions, private and public.
I think we'll have to leave it there. I want to invite all of you to continue this fascinating conversation out at our reception, buy a book, get it signed, and please join me in thanking once more our great panel and distinguished speakers.